If you're ever looking for a reason not to take your husband shopping, there's another one. There you go, that'll be better. When we find ourselves in a waiting room, it's always interesting what I or others around me find to do to pass the time. Someone was here first service, and they were talking. They'd driven a long ways to be here this weekend and see some family, and we were commenting on how traveling with kids has gotten so much easier because you have videos you can watch movies, you can watch endless amount of things, entertain your kids. But I grew up back when you actually had to hit your sister and pick on your siblings in order to pass the time. And what we do when we're waiting is important because nobody likes to wait, but we all know that waiting is a part of life. And so whether you find yourself in a doctor's office, whether you find yourself in line at the grocery store, whether you're at the mall, wherever it may be, waiting is a part of life. And when you read the story of Christmas, what you find is that waiting is a key part of that as well. And as we do that and we look at that, I want us to think about as we introduce this series called The Christmas Experience, where we're going to walk our way through a familiar story, but reminding ourselves of some of the key attributes that God reveals about himself in this season, in these texts, in Luke chapter 1 and 2, and Matthew 1, 2, and 3, and in part of John as well. And what we find is that God continues to reveal himself, as he did in other places in the Bible. Much of who he says he is and who he is, he reveals to himself in this story of the sending of his son into the world. And how Jesus comes to the world tells us a lot about the gospel that we are called to live in and to obey. And so today I want us to think about the times of waiting in our life, because all of us go through them. We all endure them. We all are in times of waiting in our life, and sometimes it's big things, sometimes little things, but waiting is never a fun thing to do. And so when you think about waiting in the Bible, one of the things that comes up is the faithfulness of God. And so today I hope that as we do talk about the waiting part of the Christmas story, I hope that we'll also realize that as we wait, it reveals to us God's faithfulness and why we should continue to be faithful when maybe God hasn't fulfilled some of the things that he said he would do and we're waiting on him for now. And I will apologize to you today. I have a cold, so if I have to sniffle and cough, I apologize for that now. I know my wife just hates that when I have to do this in front of people, and so I'll apologize to all of you now because it will happen unexpectedly here. I had a friend several years ago who preached at a nearby church when we lived in Illinois named Craig, that's a different guy. I didn't know Craig. Sorry, that's a different thing. He's a preacher in Oklahoma who's really famous. I didn't live by him. I lived by a guy by the name of Bruce Getchy. Sorry, I don't know. It's the cold medicine that I'm not taking. Bruce Getchy lived in La Harpe, Illinois, not far from where we lived. And he used to do a lot of writing. And I tucked away some words he had said under the heading of timing is everything. He wrote this, and he began to get us to think about how timing is key to so many things in our life. You've heard the phrase, timing is everything, and that's true. For example, in the area of comedy, a good joke can be greatly enhanced and told well by just the right pause and the right timing. But if you've been listening to me long enough, you know that a bad joke is a bad joke, no matter what, but a bad timing messes up a good joke. Or it's the same, timing is essential when you're dealing with people. For example, you don't have to ask for a raise when the business is not going well, or when everyone's really grumpy or the boss is angry at you. You don't try to correct someone who feels threatened by you. You don't ask for a favor when someone is under a lot of stress or angry at you. So it's a matter of timing, right? About when you ask, right? Timing is important in cooking as well, right? If you go to the barbecue grill, my children can testify to this, that a burger, a piece of meat is still raw and nasty when it's just barely cooked, or if you leave it on my grill, usually it's a piece of charcoal by the time it's done, because timing is crucial in the process of cooking. Timing is important in the world of medicine. If you catch a problem early on, you'll be able to treat it more effectively. Your timing is important in taking medication. If you take it as directed, it will be more helpful for you. If you skip doses, it loses its effectiveness. If you take extra doses, it becomes deadly to you. So timing is important in so many places in life. It's true in the world of finance. If you buy stock or sell stock, whether you make money or lose money depends on timing. When you buy, when you sell, is all about the timing of the deal. And I would add one thing to his list. and it's the idea of music. You see, timing is important in music as well. It's the difference between your local elementary band, as cute and as lovable as those little kids may be with their little instruments, the difference between those little kids and a professional orchestra. There are many differences, but maybe it comes down to their quality of play. They've mastered an instrument, but a lot of it has to do with the art of timing, about when you play, when you rest, when you don't play. And all of those things are so important. And I'll illustrate it by this. The older I get, the more that I like to listen to, I like to watch movies, but I like to listen to the soundtrack that goes with the movies in between times, because I think the enjoyment of that is something I enjoy. But John Williams wrote the Star Wars music many, many years ago, back in the 70s, right? If you're alive then, John Williams and the whole Star Wars theme is something that everybody in our culture knows. Whether you like Star Wars or not, you know what the music is. But imagine this scene with me, okay? You're sitting in a theater, it's a new Star Wars movie, and the previews are running, and finally they're done, and the theater goes dark, and you sit there in quiet. Oh, there you go. There you go. I like that. You're doubled your pay, whoever's back there did that. And then these words come up on the screen, and it says this: a long time ago in a galaxy far, far away. Now what happens next? Nothing happens. Because if you watch the beginning of those movies, that pops up there, and 5, 6, 7 seconds go by of nothing. And it's in that anticipation of the quiet that you are building excitement. Something's happening even though nothing's happening, right? It's in that quietness before the trumpets and the cymbals blast into this theater and you're caught up in the whole Star Wars theme and you're caught up into the whole adventure that is to follow, okay? So there's something to be said of that. So give Tim applause. That's creative. There you go. Very good. That's the best part of the sermon, so you should applaud right now. So, okay? And if the sermon preacher gets really dull, he'll do that again. So, okay, he's taking offers right now. So music, in every part of life, timing is everything, right? When we do the right thing at the right time, some really good things happen. When you don't do the right thing at the wrong time or the right time, it just creates problems in your life. Someone has said this in the area of music, that when they were talking about a musical score, if you remember band class and some of these things, they said this: there is no music in a rest, but there is the making of music in it. You know what a rest note is? It's those little things in between the notes. It's those places where there is no sound, technically. If you're playing those, you're not supposed to play anything. It's supposed to be a moment of quiet, at least from your instrument. And it's in that quiet that it makes the music, right? Nothing's really happening, it doesn't seem, but yet if you just have constant noise, you don't have music. It's in the making of music that those rests add life, they add intensity, they add so many things to the music that you and I listen to. And those moments of rest, those moments where it seems as if nothing is happening, are so crucial to our lives as well. As you read the Christmas story, what you find is that God has moments of activity throughout the Old Testament. If you were to put it on a musical note page, you'd find lots of notes along the way. But you'd find long periods of rest. Long periods where it didn't look like God had shown up and was doing anything. And to the casual observer, to the people of Israel, as they watched that, sometimes they struggled with, okay, God, you did that then. I see the notes that you've played in history, but now I'm caught up in a moment and I don't see that. It just doesn't seem like you're doing anything. And God's musical sheet seems to have just one large rest written over it. So what are we to do with that? But then at just the right time, God shows up. I love the way Paul summarizes the whole Christmas story. In Galatians chapter 4, verses 4 and 5, he writes these words to us. He says, when the fullness of time had come. That's the Christmas story, right? The fullness of time. And the fullness of time means everything God had built up to, everything was set, everything was in the right place, everything was as it needed to be, so that what God wanted to accomplish through his next act by sending his son into the world through a woman born of the law to redeem those under the law, so that we might receive adoption as sons, everything was set up and was where it needed to be. Now sometimes we look at life, and of course we don't see life from God's perspective. God sees the big picture looking down, and he can see the beginning, he can see the end, and he's got all those things covered. He knows where it's going. And so he's arranging pieces to say, this is where I need history to go. And so I'm putting pieces along the way, but as actors on the stage, sometimes we don't see how that makes sense. We don't see, well, God's over here doing this, but this doesn't seem to I don't see that. And it's a struggle for us. And we, like the people of Israel, sometimes begin to wonder, will God be faithful? Will God do what he said he would do? And yet Paul would remind us that as he summarizes all of God's activity through Jesus in those few simple words, in the fullness of time, God knew exactly what he was doing. God had the thing laid out. He had the right people in the right places. And in a few weeks, we're going to look at his purposes and plans and dive deeper into some of this story and look at names and places and dates and things like that. But for today, I just want you to be reminded and take note of the fact that when we think about waiting from the Bible's perspective and waiting on what God's next thing is, if you're a Christian, you're waiting for the next big thing on God's calendar, which is the return of Christ. And we're waiting and we're waiting and we're waiting and we're waiting for that. But maybe on a more personal level, there's some struggle in your life and you're waiting for God to help you or to God to take it away or to God to bring someone into your life, or you're waiting on something. And those can be really, really hard moments of our life. I love what Melvin Newland says when he describes this passage as he talks about God's perfect timing. He says this, that in this passage we find 3 perfect things that God is doing and has done in the world. You find his perfect timing, that in the fullness of time, God's timing is always perfect. You find the perfect gift, that he gives us exactly what we need. We thought we needed military conquest. The people of Israel thought they needed a new king. God says that you need a savior. You need my son to redeem you. And the third perfect thing was that perfect purpose. That God sent his son, his perfect gift to redeem us and make us right with him again. And that's God's way of doing that. And God's working in the Bible is always in a perfect time. And it's our struggle, it's our task then to work towards trusting him, to work towards faithfulness that says, I know where you're going. And I trust that you do have the end, just as I believe that you had the beginning. And I'm going to keep trusting you, even though I don't see where all the pieces are at or how everything's playing out or what my little role in this little play really is even all about, how it fits into the big picture. I'm going to trust you, and I'm going to be faithful to you while I wait. So learning to wait is a key thing that we must do. And so even though you read back through your Old Testament, you read through the stories of dozens and dozens of people who had interactions with God and who struggled, all of them went through periods in their life where they had to wait. For example, David waited 13 years from the time that God says, hey, you're going to be my next king. 13 years of waiting and not knowing how he's actually going to become a king because he's got all these hard things against him. He's like, I don't know how I'm going to get there, but I'm going to be faithful. Joseph went through a period of 20, 25 years from the time that he had his dream that someday I'm going to do some great things that happen in my life. And he goes through really terrible things, really hard struggles, deep, painful things before he sees the end. So those are examples, but over and over you can find people in the Old Testament whose lives are a testament to the fact that God uses this discipline, this tool of waiting in our life. Now, you and I, from where we're standing, we're concerned with the outcome, right? We want to make sure that history gets to the right place, and so we're panicked about the end. God is not panicked about the end. God knows the end, right? He's already set that. That's what Jesus is all about. That's one act of it that's going to set a bookmark, and now the other side of that is someday Christ will return. Those are the bookmarks. And so God's got the beginning, he's got the end. He's worried about the things in the middle, about what he can do in us while we're waiting. So oftentimes our view of waiting is, well, God, I want the solution. God is oftentimes looking, I want the process. I want to be doing something in your life right now as you wait, that when you finally get to wherever you're going to go, you'll be better for it. And that's a hard struggle for us because we want to know the end. We want the end to come quickly. We want to know where everything's going. And we struggle with that. But that's where our faith in God's faithfulness comes in. Max Lucado would write these words, and I like what he said many years ago in a book he wrote. And he talked about the doubt and the root of where our doubts come from and why our faith is sometimes hard when he said this, that clouds of doubt are created when the warm, moist air of our expectations meet the cold air of God's silence. If you're driving Friday night, early Saturday morning, there's a lot of fog in our area, right? And so if you're driving in the fog, if you've ever driven in the fog, you know that's not a pleasant place because you can't see. Your view is so limited, all you can see is just a little bit ahead of you. Where does that fog come from? Well, there's warm air, there's cold air, and those two things meet and it creates a cloud kind of effect. And the same thing happens to us spiritually. That we read the Bible and we read of God's promises to us. Promises that God has made and oftentimes fulfilled in the lives of millions of people now after a long time of following after him. And we read those promises, and so our expectations grow, and we think, well, God will meet my needs. God will provide friendship or love. God will do. God will. God will come back someday. And so we have these expectations that get built up in our mind. And they're right. They're built based on Bible things, Bible promises. But yet oftentimes what seems like God's silence feels so cold. That God I expect, yet there's sometimes often such, it seems cold. It seems as if God's not doing anything to move those two things, to move our promises towards fulfillment. And so we live with hurt, we live with loneliness, we live with struggle, we live with sin, we live with temptation, we live with a lot of hard things. And all of those things create a cloud of doubt in our mind if we're not careful. We illustrated this a few weeks ago, probably months ago by now. I think I read this passage to you, but I think it's relevant to you here again from Matthew chapter 11 about John the Baptist. From that passage from Galatians chapter 4, we read where God's perfect timing, and the first new thing after that 400-year gap of the Old Testament, prophets stopping, doing their work. There's like a 400-year gap of a lot of really nothing happening. No new books were written, no new prophets showed up. It's a lot of very painful, difficult time for Israel as one foreign power after another kind of overran them and took over their rights and their rulership. It was a very difficult time. But the first new thing that God did was to send a forerunner, to send a prophet who would go before Jesus. And that guy was John the Baptist. If you read Luke chapter 1, you read that John the Baptist had his own special birth, and this cool thing happened. And now John the Baptist shows up, and he comes up, and he finds himself a river, and he starts to preach, and people start to listen to him, and he calls them to repent, to prepare themselves because the Messiah is finally coming. So basically what he's saying is, hey, the new thing that God has been promising for century after century after century, it's coming, and I'm the forerunner of it, so get ready. And so he's baptizing people, and all these great things. People are excited. John is excited. Finally, one day, Jesus shows up, and he says, look, that's the guy. That's the Lamb of God. This is the guy who's going to make us right with God. This is the guy you've been waiting for. And so Jesus shows up, and John begins to kind of fade into the background as Jesus begins to grow, and John's okay with that. But apparently something happens in John's thinking, because this passage in Matthew 11 is an interesting passage in light of the guy who boldly stands before throngs of people and says, hey, that's the Messiah. That's the guy we've been waiting for. But then he says this later on, and note the circumstances. When John, who was in prison, heard about the deeds of the Messiah, he sent his disciples to ask him, are you the one who is to come, or should we be looking for someone else? Again, that's an interesting question coming from a guy who just a few chapters before is standing there boldly saying, that's the Messiah. What's changed? Well, he has these expectations. He has these expectations that, hey, Jesus is going to come, and we don't know what John was thinking about what Jesus was going to become, but the popular myth of the day was that he's going to fight the Romans, and there's going to be a new kingdom, and there's going to be new cool things, and it's all going to go well for the Jewish people finally, after centuries of it going really bad. But where's John now? He's sitting in a prison cell. And the guy who put him there really hates him because he's saying bad things about his lifestyle choices. And so he really hates him. And so eventually in the next few verses, he's going to get his head chopped off. And he knows that life's not good. So he's got expectations about, hey, the new king is here. But the realities are that, man, this is hard. I'm in this prison cell with the threat of having my head chopped off. It's not a pleasant place to be. So what's created in the middle of his expectations and his doubts, or expectations and realities? Doubt creates a cloud. And so he faces this. He says, look, Jesus, just explain this to me. Just speak into my life. Verify this for me one more time. But Jesus goes on to say this. He quotes a passage from the book of Isaiah that promises this is who the Messiah is going to be as a way of reminding John, look, I'm exactly who I'm supposed to be. I'm doing what I'm supposed to be. John replied, go back and report to John what you hear and see. The blind receive sight, the lame walk, those who have leprosy are cleansed, the deaf hear, the dead are raised, and the good news is proclaimed to the poor. But blessed is anyone who does not stumble on account of me. What's he challenging John with? John, I know it's hard for you. I know your life circumstances aren't going the direction that maybe you thought they would, but don't give up your faith in my faithfulness. Don't lose sight of my faithfulness in your life, even though it may not look like the right time or the right circumstances or things aren't working out according to what you think they should be. Don't give up on my faithfulness. And so John is wrestling with the same thing that every Christian or every follower of God, whether Old Testament or New Testament, we've wrestled with in those moments of doubt. It's the question, will God keep his promise? Will God keep his promise? Will God provide for me when I find myself in need? Will God protect my heart? Will God provide the people in my life? Will God, and fill in the blank, will he heal my broken heart? Will God eventually, will Jesus come back? Will he do what he has promised he would do? And our response to that question determines the outcome of our life. If I respond, yes, I believe God will do that, and I have faith in that, then that's going to determine how I live. If doubt begins to take over, and I have more of doubt than I have faith, then I'm going to think, well, I'm probably not going to live real passionately for Jesus and his kingdom because my faith has become weak. And so since most of our lives are spent waiting on God to keep a lot of different promises in our life, but especially his ultimate promise to return, what can we learn from the Christmas story about waiting on God? Just two simple things I want to put out before you here today. Number one, I want you to understand that waiting on God is never easy. All right, we've kind of already preached the point, but I just want to put it in simple words, that waiting on God is never an easy thing. And a lot of you know that. If you've gone through things where you have earnestly sought after God, you've got some issue in your life, some struggle in your life, and you just really have begged God to say, God, you got to help me with this. I can't take this hurting heart or this broken or this struggle with temptation, whatever it is. God, I really need help. And maybe his help to you, I don't think he ever gives us a no, I'm not going to help you. But maybe his help comes in so many different forms than we expected. And just like with John the Baptist, we end up in circumstances that we didn't anticipate on our own. And maybe just admission that, you know what, this is not going the way I thought it was. And there's something healthy about being able to say to God, God, this is not what I thought it was going to be. I'm not sure where you're at, and I'm struggling. And I'm thankful that the book of Psalms, throughout its pages, uses a little two-word phrase that I think is helpful for us. Because the book of Psalms to the Old Testament people, to Israel, was their song of prayer. It was their book of prayers, and it was their book of worship. And so when they went to worship God, these are the psalms they would sing and read to each other. When they gathered and sang songs, these are the songs they sang. But look at the little phrase, how long? Little search, 15 times it appears in the book of Psalms. And almost every time, it is a person who is in deep pain, who is crying out to God to say, God, how long before this is better? How long before it looks like you're working on my behalf? And they're not psalms that are angry saying, God, I'm done. They're just psalms saying, God, I know your promises. I still have faith in them, but it's just hard waiting. It's really hard to wait, God. And I think they're just cries of honest reflection. Psalm 6, verse 3 says, my soul is in deep anguish. How long, Lord? How long? Ever find your soul in deep anguish? You can relate to that. It doesn't seem like it ever will stop. Psalm 13, David looks around and says, how long, Lord? Will you forget me forever? How long will you hide your face from me? Ever feel like God's not listening to you? That God's not paying attention to you? That you keep asking and you're just struggling? It doesn't seem like he's looking or paying attention? You can relate to David. Psalm 35, how long, Lord, will you look on? Rescue me from the ravages. He's talking about the enemies, a lot of people that are attacking him, saying things. How long are you going to let that go on? How long? Psalm 74 says, we are given no signs from God, no prophets are left. None of us knows how long this will be. In other words, it seems like God's just been really quiet for a long, long time, and they're just struggling with that. And I think it's just healthy for us to see that when you struggle, and it feels like your broken heart doesn't seem to get relief, or it seems like God is silent and he doesn't seem to break through and say something clearly to you, and when all those things happen, you're not the first person to feel that way. In fact, a guy 3,000 years ago felt just the same way. And people have resonated with his words ever since because we identify with that. That's the human condition, right? It's hard for us to learn to wait. It's not an easy thing. Joni Eareckson Tada, if you've been around the church much over the last 30 years, she's a lady whose name pops up a lot. She's got a great testimony. She's a great, great lady. But her life has been anything but easy. In fact, when she was like 16, 17 years old, she was in a diving accident and she was paralyzed from the neck down and has been in a wheelchair that you see there ever since. And in a little blog devotional thing that she shared a year or two ago, she wrote these words. And she said, hi, I am Joni Eareckson Tada, and I know something about waiting. I have spent so much of my time waiting in this wheelchair. After the diving accident in which I became paralyzed, I waited to be moved from the intensive care unit to a room on the hospital floor. Once there, I would wait all day on a stretcher outside the urology lab waiting to go in, or waiting to go to radiology or some other ology. From the hospital, I waited to go to the rehabilitation center, and once there, it was more waiting to go to physical therapy. From therapy, it was waiting to be pushed back to my room. In the evenings, of course, I'd always be waiting for my friends or family to come for a visit, and it seems I was forever waiting just to go home. So her life has been full of waiting, but she said this about her experience with what waiting was to her. Back then, for me, waiting was simply killing time. I was just hanging around, and she says, unfortunately, many of us look at waiting that way, and I'm sure you do too. You wait at the dentist, then the checkout line, you're waiting for a phone call or a promotion or a good medical report, and usually when we think of waiting for these things, we get a mental picture of just leaning up against a wall with our arms folded, yawning, glancing at our watch, just killing time. But she says this, and I want you to look at these words with me. But friends, God has not given us time to kill. He gives us time for us to use. And in his vocabulary, there's no such thing as wasted time. So oftentimes when you and I look at this whole issue of waiting, we're thinking, okay, God, you're not doing anything. But oftentimes God is saying, I am doing a lot of things that you don't see under the radar as I'm working on your heart, as I'm trying to train or prepare or to bring something into your life. God is always working. God is never wasting time in our life. And God calls us not to sit and fold our arms and sit on the sidelines, but to stay active, to stay engaged in life while we are waiting. I love what Psalm 73, one of the passages I read before about the how long, Lord, is Psalm 74, but there's kind of a parallel passage to it in Psalm 73 that says this. He talks about this, but as for me, my feet had almost slipped. I had nearly lost my foothold. In other words, what's he saying? I looked at my life, and my faith was really struggling. The cloud of doubt has really come heavy on him, okay? For I envied the arrogant when I saw the prosperity of the wicked. What's he complaining about? What's he down about? All the people who are just doing all the wrong things seem like they get all the advantages. All the good things tend to go their way, and he's just feeling like he's really struggling because does it do any good to be good? Does it do any good to try to be a good person when just the wicked seem to prosper and do so well? And that really discouraged him. And his question was, he doesn't say it, but behind that is, how long are you going to put up with this? How long are you going to do this? But what is it that brought balance to his life? When I tried to understand all of this, it troubled me deeply until I entered the sanctuary of God. And then I understood their final destiny. What was it that brought some balance to his life, that kept him focused on faithfulness? He went into a place where he was reminded of who God was, what God had done, and what God had promised. And by looking at who God was and what God had done, it gave him hope to say, okay, I'll keep holding on for the future because I see who God is and I see what God has done in my people. And so I'm not going to give up, even though I'm frustrated, even though it's hard, even though this waiting thing is such a hard thing. And what was God doing? God was encouraging and strengthening his hearts, even in a time of waiting. And he came through on the other side stronger. It's a beautiful psalm if you read the whole thing, but I love what he says there. And so waiting is always more difficult than we ever hoped it would be. But a second thing I want you to see with, and this is the promise of Scripture. This is why, as we jump into this series for Christmas time, I hope that you'll be reminded that waiting on God is always worth it. Waiting on God is always worth it. Yes, it's hard. It is hard, and the Bible never lies to us and says, hey, waiting is an easy thing. Read the stories of so many people who went through periods of waiting, and what you're going to find is they go through days and months and years sometimes of hard things, of anguish, but their testimony would always be that waiting on God was the best thing they ever did. It was worth it in the end. Listen to what Romans chapter 15, verse 4 says. For everything that was written in the past was written to teach us, so that through the endurance that is taught through the Scriptures and the encouragement they provide, we might have hope. Why did God give you a Bible? Why did God tell you all those stories that you think, those are people that lived a long, long time ago in a land far, far away from me? Why in the world does that matter to me? Those stories matter because they remind you of how God was faithful in somebody else's life. And as you read them, you're reminded to say, you know what? I can make a long list of people that I read their stories that God was faithful to them. And so that should speak into my life. And Paul would say that those things were written so that through the endurance of Scriptures and the encouragement they provide, that we can have hope. What is it that combats doubt? It's oftentimes hope. And so hope comes in and says, keep going. So I want to finish by just reading a passage from Hebrews chapter 10. The writer of Hebrews is trying to give hope to a group of people who have found it difficult to continue to live their Christian life. They're facing difficulties, they're facing persecutions, they're going through a lot of difficult stuff in their life, and their major temptation is to allow doubt because of their pain to kind of get them off track. Say, you know what, it's easier just to go with the flow, easier just to go back to my old life than to keep trying to live this life for Jesus. Note what he says in verse 32 of Hebrews 10. So remember those earlier days after you had received the light. In other words, when they had come to know who Jesus was, come to a relationship with him. When you endured in a great conflict full of suffering. So their early days of being a Christian weren't easy, okay? They've always had it hard. Sometimes you were publicly exposed to insult and persecution. People said all kinds of things about them. And other times you stood side by side by those who were so treated. You suffered along with those in prison and joyfully accepted the confiscation of your property because you knew that you yourselves had what? What was it that kept them going through difficult things? You knew you had a better and lasting possession. It was their forward-looking life. It was their trust that God's faithfulness is going to take care of the things that I am personally losing, the reputation hit I'm taking, all the things that are happening in my life right now. The future is better because of my faith in Christ. Okay, that's what kept them going. So do not throw away your confidence. They had it, but now it's gotten so hard and it's just kept going and going and going. Thinking, okay, is it worth it? He says, don't throw away your confidence. It will be what? Richly rewarded. He says, you know what? Don't give up. Don't lose sight of God's faithfulness, even though sometimes life can be hard. It goes on to say you need to persevere so that when you have done the will of God, you will receive what he has promised. And then he gives 2 Old Testament quotes to back that up. For in just a little while, he who is coming will come and will not delay. Again, a forward-looking promise to say don't give up on God's faithfulness. His past history reminds you of what he will do. And a second quote, but my righteous one will live by faith. You see, what is it that grows in those places of waiting more than anything else? When you continue to stay engaged, your faith grows. Faith doesn't grow when you see the end result. Faith grows in the waiting room. Faith grows when you're in that place where you're thinking, okay, I don't know where the future is going, but I'm going to learn and I'm going to grow. I'm going to keep following. I'm going to keep trusting. That's where faith grows. And God says, I take no pleasure in the one who shrinks back. And so he finishes it with this final thing in verse 39. But we do not belong to those who shrink back and are destroyed, but to those who have faith and are saved. So what does the Christmas story tell us? I think one of the major things it tells us is that God is a God who fulfills his promises. We'll look over the next few weeks at some of those promises in the Old Testament. But there's many of them, dozens and dozens of them, that God said, this is who I'm going to send you. And Jesus fulfills them all. And I think one of the things that he does that for, and especially that he records those for us, is so that those of us going forward in the immediate time after Jesus and in the centuries that would now come after Jesus, so that we'd be able to look back and say, hey, that God fulfilled in the fullness of time, in the right and perfect time, God fulfilled his promise to centuries of people he had made in the Old Testament. And now he's made promises going forward. And his encouragement is, don't doubt me. Don't give up on believing in my faithfulness because I will be faithful to do what I have said in your life. So don't get discouraged. Don't give up. Again, a baby in a manger doesn't seem like a great start to a life of world transforming work. And yet history has shown that all the great powers have come and gone, but one humble little birth changed everything. It was just simply a reminder that when the time had fully come, God sent his son. And what that son offered was 2 things, I guess, from Galatians 4. One, he offered us understanding, that he understands what it's like because he was born to be like us. He lived under the same law, same body, so he understands. And that's helpful when you're dealing with how long do I have to wait through this? Well, Jesus had to deal with it as well. But a second thing it does is it gives us new birth, that new hope. If you were here last week, Ted talked about that new hope that nothing in this world can touch because it is anchored in something that is outside of this world. And that's what Jesus came to give us. Let me just finish with these last 2 verses from Hebrews chapter 12. Listen to what this is encouraged to do. It says this, Hebrews 12, therefore, since we are surrounded by such a great cloud of witnesses, a whole host of people in chapter 11 that he has identified said their faith was what made God proud of them. We're surrounded by such a great cloud of witnesses. Let us throw off everything that hinders and the sin that so easily entangles. Let us run with perseverance the race that is marked out for us, fixing our eyes on Jesus, the pioneer and perfecter of faith. For the joy set before him, he endured the cross, scorning its shame, and sat down at the right hand of the throne of God. Consider him who endured such opposition from sinners, so that you will not grow weary and lose heart. Would you pray with me, please?